This is the YouTube version of the Hidden Experience audio podcast. This show is hosted by Mike Cleland, and that's me, and it is available on most of the popular podcast platforms. Just search out Hidden Experience Audio. And if you want to support the show, you can find it on Patreon, as well as Buy Me a Coffee. This YouTube version has ads, but the audio version is always ad-free. And you can also join my YouTube channel here. And now the show. Audio conversation with Kelly Chase, recorded Sunday, January 5th, 2025. You might know Kelly from her very popular podcast, the UFO Rabbit Hole, but you might not know that she has just put out a 3-part documentary series titled COSMOSIS. And it's now out and available for viewing. It should be easy to find on any number of streaming services. If you are at all familiar with her work, you will know her strong, steady voice and the methodical and disciplined way she digs into the many divergent aspects of the UFO mystery. Yet you might not know about her own experiences and the depth of her sensitivity, especially in what would be the more spiritual realms. It's this more elusive facet of the UFO that we'll be exploring on this episode. And please know that the show notes will have plenty of links, including 2 very important podcasts hosted by Kelly on her site, the UFO Rabbit Hole. But before we start, I need to say this episode, maybe more than any other that I have done, is exactly why I am putting out these podcasts. I am so proud of this conversation and the depth of what Kelly and I worked to explore. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say this. We captured something marvelous. Our conversation runs about an hour and a half. Please enjoy. Kelly, I want to thank you so much for saying yes to this interview. It means a lot to me.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here, and I missed you. We haven't talked in a while, so it's a good chance to catch up.
Well, you've been busy.
Yeah, it's been the craziest few months. It just feels like 2024 just flew by.
Yeah. So for this show, I want to cover a few things. And part of it for you, I realize, is something deeply personal. At the beginning of last year, you did a podcast titled Through the Looking Glass, and that was part 1. And that was from last year, earlier last year, almost a year ago now, was titled My Initiation into the Anomalous. And then 10 months later, you posted part 2, and that was titled The Strange Tale of Tom Matt and Upsight. Okay, for me, this 2-part set of podcasts is absolutely vital to understand, or it might be better to say, to attempt to understand this mystery, which seems to have UFOs as part of what's going on, but there is a lot more. And those other things get dismissed, often with contempt by the mainstream. And when I say mainstream, I mean the mainstream of UFO authors and researchers. So you did 2 personal podcasts almost a year apart. And in the middle there, in those 10 months, you were very busy working on an ambitious documentary project with J. Christopher King, who I know well. And that, as of less than a week ago, it is available for the whole world to see. So for this conversation, I want to talk about the 2 podcast episodes and the documentary and how those, in my mind, in a way, seem to converge some way. So please, I want to hear about the documentary, how it's going.
Oh, thank you so much for asking. Well, it's been a crazy week. It'll be out a week as of tomorrow, and we've been really surprised that it's been kind of climbing the charts. We've been gotten up to number 7 on the Amazon documentary charts, and we got up to number 2 on the Apple TV store out of all television shows, which was really crazy.
Number 2?
Yeah. We were really surprised, and we had this is a fully independently funded effort, and we had a $0 marketing budget. And so to have gotten the kind of response that we have over the last week has been really humbling and really gratifying and more than a little surprising, but we're really excited about it.
Wow, that's amazing. So there's 3 episodes. And for the purposes of this conversation, I kind of only want to talk about episode 3. And I think you understand exactly why that one, I relate to that one so strongly. And then one more thing. I've seen all 3 episodes. I think I watched them within 24 hours of the launch. I need to thank you. At no point in that series was there ever like kind of a swish noise or kind of a boom noise when there was editing. There's a sort of, that's the editing technique that I simply cannot watch Ancient Aliens because of that ham-fisted form of editing. I don't like being treated like a elementary school student when I'm trying to take in information on a documentary. So I basically wanted to hug the monitor when I realized that was the direction you and Jay were going.
Oh, thank you. No, that was something Jay and I really wanted from the very beginning, was to do something that kind of broke the genre a little bit, because it feels like it has gotten a little stale. There's like a very particular kind of editing style that gets employed that's either like kind of more on the sci-fi end or more on kind of like the news journalism end. But both of those seem to leave out kind of a humanity and kind of an intimacy to this information that I feel like is so critical and gets left out of the conversation. And so we always kind of wanted it to not be that. But we also were very lucky to work with some really incredible collaborators. Zev Deans was our video editor, and then Mike Rubino did the film score for us. And between the two of them, I think that they managed to help us really elevate the aesthetic to a place that felt more respectful and also just authentic, something that felt more human and less like a, whiz bang kind of production.
So I'm going to ask you, how do you see episode 3, and how does that stand alone? For me, it stood alone. It felt very different than the first 2.
Yeah, it's my favorite episode. It's the one I was most excited to write. And I think it was the one that was closest to our hearts. When you're making something, obviously a big part of our goal is to reach a larger audience of people and people who might not be as initiated into this stuff. And I think you can see more of that in episodes 1 and 2. Like, we try to do the best version of that. But for people who are deep into the subject and experiencers in particular, I think what people have really been starved for on the screen, especially, is just something that is honest and kind of unflinching in its approach to the actual experience itself, because that's the one thing that for whatever reason we're just not allowed to talk about. And so we wanted to do that in a way that was honest. We wanted to do it in a way that, instead of just like presenting this string of impossible events and then, putting it on it kind of always gets put in a place with experiencers where these shows end up interrogating the experiencer as to like how this could possibly be true. And instead, we wanted to flip that around and treat our experiencers with respect and dignity, and instead interrogate like what is the nature of our reality such that these things happen, and what can we learn from that, and trying to give people some actual frameworks and methodologies for approaching ideas that we know are really challenging for people who haven't had those experiences themselves, or who maybe haven't faced those experiences head on yet. And so, in so a lot of ways, I think episode 3 is kind of the heartbeat of the show and the thing we were most excited about.
You said something just now about the experiencers. You said we're not allowed to talk about that. Like, this is something I want to drill into this a little bit, because this is something that I find very frustrating, because there seems to be this wall, this stigma that just simply does not get broached by the majority of, especially the let's say the more high end of the documentary productions. There's some very low budget, poor quality documentaries that cover it nicely, but those are difficult to take seriously in like a mainstream kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the reasons that we really wanted to be independent, was because I think that, it's, if you have a show that's done through a larger network, that there's limits to how far they're actually going to let you go. Because when you're making something for a mass market like that, like at the end of the day, you're not making art, you're making a widget, and you need to sell X amount of them to get back the money that you put into it. And so they end up these decisions end up getting made by committee, and you end up producing something that is going to be ingestible by the largest number of people. And so I think that that is a necessary thing that is happening, and that it is helping us in a certain sense. But there's a lot of people who are just so much further down the road with this conversation, and there's almost no media talking to those people. And, Jay and I see that a lot in our work, with him being director of the Experiencer Group and with my podcast and the community we've built there. We're talking to people all the time who are going through these things now, or who went through them, have been going through them for decades. And like that conversation needs a place to happen as well. And since we're independent, and because we did it on a tighter budget, and we, DIY'd as much of it as possible, we don't have to sell 1 million of them for this to be a viable path for us. And so we're able to make something that's not for like the lowest common denominator. It's for the people who actually are ready to have these conversations. And that was really important to us.
That episode begins with a fellow with an English accent describing what at first seemed like a typical event, sighting. And then it turned into something much more sensitive and much like he literally teared up. And I almost teared up watching that thing. This is even before the credits rolled that he tells this story. I don't want to give too much away, but it has everything to do with what I have been finding in my own research, that there is this emotional power to these events that transcends mere lights in the sky.
Yeah, no, that was that gentleman's name is Max McCabe, and we are so grateful that he was willing to share his story with us. And then the recreation was done by Finn Hanley, and I loved starting with that one because there's elements of that case, even just visually, that feel very kind of familiar. Like it sounds more like the kind of like mainstream conversation. I love even that the thing that he reports seeing. And we don't ever say this in the show, and like I don't know that it's a connection, that we on purpose didn't voice that connection. But what he sees actually kind of looks like the gimbal from the famous gimbal video, and so it kind of has that connectability to the kind of disclosure discourse. But then once you dig deeper into that story, you realize that there's so much more going on there, and that the emotional content and the spiritual content of that experience was just far more than you would hear in a typical story. And so we wanted to start in that place where we kind of put that weirdness right in people's faces from the very beginning and raise that question early. And I think that story does a beautiful job.
The voice of Jay comes in and he asks the fellow sitting there being interviewed, and Jay's voice comes in and he says, "What were you thinking about in the moments before you saw the light in the sky?" And he pauses and says, "I was thinking about my grandmother who recently deceased, and if she is with my grandfather in a better place." I mean, he's basically saying, is there a heaven? And in that moment, that was the exact moment the light appeared. That is exactly what I'm finding in my own work, those powerful mythic elements showing up in these accounts.
Yeah, and I think that's why we wanted to show that exactly that, right? Because I think that those of us, obviously I know these are the kinds of questions that you ask, but I think typically a lot of people who are coming into the space, who are making, shows for a mass market or something like that, they're not asking questions like, what were you thinking right before you saw it? Like they're not asked like questions like, had anything traumatic in your life happened, in the preceding time? Like, what was going on for you right then? What happened after? Like, did you start having weird dreams? Did you start to see the world differently? Did you start to see yourself differently? Because when you know the right questions to ask, you find that these stories go so much deeper, and that the part that we tend to relay through storytelling in some ways is like the least interesting part. It's not always these things unravel and unfurl in all of these different directions and change things about your life. And, it's hard enough to say to somebody, I saw something weird in the sky, but then to be like, and then I started having these crazy dreams. And then some of those dreams started to come true. And then like all of these weird things that can happen to people, then those are the things that end up transforming their lives and really changing how they see the world. And that's the part of the story that's just not being told at all.
Yes, I agree. It's being told. There's people out there telling
Right.
it. It's hard to get that information out there to the mainstream. It's easy to have it in a book or some hidden podcast, but to have the general population hear those kinds of stories is really heartening to me. So thank you.
Thank you.
At one point in the documentary, and I wrote this down, you said, as much as we want to ignore some details, the reality is we can't. And what were you getting at there?
I mean, I think that you see this a lot. And I think it's something that's always been an issue. If you go back and you read Vallée and you read Keel, a lot of their major gripes were with other investigators was just that like they were going to these places where there had been a sighting and there had been a crash or something like that. And they were doing this investigation, but they were only taking the pieces of the puzzle that supported kind of like the extraterrestrial hypothesis or like whatever it was that they were trying to make fit. But that it's always been the case that there are parts of these stories that just don't fit. And it's not just parts. It's like kind of the fabric of the story itself ends up being kind of existing in this sort of murky area where it has this dream logic or like things don't happen in the right order or there's something about it that calls the entire thing into question. And that kind of is the nature of those stories, which is a really, really important and really fascinating data point that can tell us so much, I think, about the nature of non-human intelligences and even who we are and the nature of our reality. Like there's so much potential to be mined there, but because we don't want to sit with the discomfort of not knowing what those things mean and like really treating those things as an actual unknown, that we end up missing that. And so, I think that that's something that's really important is to tell these stories with their full integrity. And a lot of times that just, it's harder to get that. It's hard enough to get that done in the mainstream, but I think even among people who are more initiated, like these things just get so weird and the rabbit hole goes so deep that it's hard to talk about.
So I noticed something. Each episode begins with an owl, and then each episode ends with an owl. I have to ask why that got put in there.
Well, of course. Well, I mean, Jay and I are both big fans of your work, and that symbolism, I feel like ever since I put out the episode that I did with you, like I still, like I get emails from people or people come up to me and they're like, I had an owl thing after,
Send them to me. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And it happens all the time. Sometimes even not related to you. It's just like someone will be like, I was watching your show and then all of a sudden this owl was like ramming into my window. And, I just find, so, I mean, obviously like we admire your work and it's something that comes up so often. And we wanted something that could represent the UFO without, we wanted to represent the complexity of it and sort of the mythology of it and the naturalism of it. And that it's definitely something that's a part of our environment. And the owl just perfectly encapsulates all of those things. And so it ended up being a big part of the imagery.
Well, I didn't come up with the owl thing, so it was well understood within the research community well before I came along. I'm the guy who kind of went nutty about it. But what's interesting is that it has become the book came out. The Messengers, my book came out 9 years ago, just a little under 9 years ago, and that I see people using the owl and referencing the owl, and I see people like I've heard podcasts where people will say, oh, I saw had a UFO experience and I saw an owl. And everyone goes, well, of course.
Right.
Like the host and other people. And I'm like, well, this is like that wouldn't have happened 10 years ago, but it's happening now. And there's a funny kind of realization that the ideas that I worked really hard to present are now self-evident in a way that they were not 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I have no sense of ownership over these things in that sense, but I am really like amazed that it has crossed that line where it is now, no, you don't even need to comment on it. It's become such a shorthand for the bigger mystery. And I would also say that for me, the owl is the totem of the transformational process. Mm. And you hinted at that in like the questions that aren't being asked of the witnesses. How has your life changed? Because that's what I'm finding, is that people who have these experiences are often transformed in profound ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that was something that I think I agree is undeniable. And it's something that I think in some ways, in certain circles in ufology, people are afraid to talk about it, because I think that there's sort of this sense that that there's been such a long struggle to just get any kind of credibility in the mainstream at all, that they're like, don't scare them, like don't.
Oh, I get it. Oh, I totally get it. I realize, keep going, please.
Yeah. And I just think that, and I think that people are afraid of being seen as crazy. That's certainly something, speaking of the, Through the Looking Glass episodes, like that's certainly something that I talked about there and that I've struggled with. It's hard to present yourself in the world that way, and to tell people I had this totally unexplained experience. It makes no sense whatsoever. And then after that, like everything about me changed and I got into a bunch of like weird stuff that I wasn't into before. Like that's not a comfortable story to tell just your average person. And I don't know that you always come off sounding great. And so, it's hard for us to talk about this stuff, but it's also by far probably not just the most fascinating, but probably the most salient point about the phenomenon. If we're really trying to figure out what this thing is, I don't know that talking about tech and vehicles is going to get us to the heart of this thing nearly as quickly as trying to understand like what it does to us. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, we don't have access to the tech and the vehicles. That stuff is kept in like the holiest of military holies underground. Like they're not going to show that to us. And so like what we do have is the deposit of the experience or narrative in the culture. And like that's what we have to work with. And the fact that we're unwilling to use the data that we have, it puts us in a really tough position. And I mean, obviously there's tons of people who are doing that, but I think there's a struggle even within the greater UFO community. I think there's a lot of people who don't understand the importance of that.
I agree. Okay, so please, I want to hear more about this. You talked about it beautifully in your first podcast series, but you had a powerful, I don't even know what to call it, visionary experience.
Yeah.
And this was well before you were into the UFO thing at all.
It was very early in it. I had only been, this was back in August of 2021, and it was May 2021 when I first kind of got into UFOs. I was going back to a place, the Outer Banks in North Carolina, where I'd seen a UFO when I was a kid. And I had just started paying attention to some of the stories that were coming out. And I'm not usually good at taking time off. And so I was going to the beach and I need something to keep me busy. And I was like, I'm going to get to the bottom of this UFO thing. And obviously I did not get to the bottom of it in a week or since.
Yeah, don't be in any hurry to get to the bottom of it. That I can assure you, you will never get to the bottom of it. So keep going.
I just think it's funny that I thought I could in a week. And so I got really obsessed because I could tell that there was something going on, but I couldn't figure out what that was. And all of it was really challenging for me because at that point I was sort of like, I'd been, all of my adult life, I'd been an atheist. I kind of had that like strict materialist, physicalist, atheistic view of the world. And I was very comfortable in that. It seems crazy to me now, but at the time I felt like I had never really seen anything that would make me think otherwise. And it just seemed all very clear to me. But after a few months of kind of just going down the UFO rabbit hole, which is where my podcast got its name, I had an experience that I still don't totally know how to talk about. I think, you could probably call it a mystical experience of some kind or a spiritual experience, which I think is a classification I ran from a very long time. But it's hard to explain. I did my best in the episode, but basically it was kind of an experience of, I guess I would say like cosmic consciousness. Mm-hmm. I felt like I saw kind of beyond myself and my individual self, and that I saw things sort of outside of the flow of time. And I felt that I was sort of guided through that experience by an entity that I didn't see, but that I felt that I knew very intimately. And I came out of that experience.
Oh, here, let me just, I sorry to interrupt.
Mhm.
I mean, what physically was happening? Like, what room were you in? Like, how did this emerge into your
Yeah.
headspace, into your reality?
So it was a Saturday morning in August, and I was getting ready to spend another day just like maniacally researching UFOs. And at that point, I was reading kind of everything. I didn't even know it was good. I didn't know which way was up. I just, anything I could get my hands on. And I was on my king size bed in my room with like books and stuff scattered all around me and notebooks and highlighters. And I was going to like dive into this for the day. And then it just happened. I don't know what triggered it. I don't know. I was just suddenly in it. And it maybe only lasted about 2 minutes tops. But it seemed to go on for much longer than that also. And I get the sense that I was shown a lot of things about the future and about like things I was supposed to do. But I also got like a really strong sense of my life and an understanding that like all of it had been leading me up to this place, that even like not believing in God was an important part of the puzzle, because the thing that I needed to do next was I needed to be able to talk to people who like didn't believe in anything and like help them get there. And so like I had to know that place to do that work. Like I saw all of that. I don't remember a ton of it now. Like a lot of it feels walled off. There's been like a few just images and ideas that have persisted, that some of which have ended up strangely being like a signpost towards something else
Mm-hmm.
that I would see later. But I came out of that experience completely changed. Like I was a different person after that. And it was really scary because like just to have that happen so quickly. And, like the first thing I did was I went to my fiance at the time, he's my husband now, and was just crying because, he and I had been good friends for like 10 years before we ever started dating. Like we really knew each other. And then here I am being like, actually, this shared worldview that we have, I don't have it anymore. And I think this whole other set of things. And I'm fundamentally different and my values are different. And also like, I think I'm about to quit my job and go do something totally different. And like, that's a scary thing to bring to your partner.
Whoa. So you said, I think I'm going to quit my job and do something totally different. Within how long was that after the event itself?
I mean, I knew right away that I just knew that I would. I knew that I had to start the podcast. I knew that there would be a show. I knew kind of like the time frame of how long that was going to take.
So you had a 2-minute visionary moment on your bed covered in UFO books.
Mm-hmm.
And then all these things happened essentially instantly.
Yeah, all at once. It was not an experience. That's why another reason it makes it so hard to talk about is because it's like outside of the flow of time. And so like there's an enormous amount of content that spanned like so many things like all at once that I can't think that like going back and trying to reconstruct it in any kind of way that makes sense is like fraught at best. It's not easy.
Oh, yeah. So just like, you're not telling me nothing I haven't heard over and over again from people who have reached out to me. So I feel this is territory I feel very comfortable talking about. So, but I recognize that, as I said earlier, like there's this transformative events that take place in people's lives, and they're not subtle.
No. No, it changed everything like in a second. And that's a distressing thing to go through. And I'm really grateful that my family and friends have been so like supportive and open, because I became a completely different person. And I feel like I was allowed to do that, but I don't know that everybody's always so lucky in that. And I had a lot of support. So I was very lucky in that, but it's still a very stressful, rough process to go through. And then to in the middle of that, feel like you've got this like thing that you have to do like immediately, like right now.
A sense of mission.
Yeah.
That's right in the checklist of what people talk about. So you didn't see a UFO, but you're describing all the things that a UFO witness would sometimes experience.
Yeah. And it seemed like my like intense desire to know about UFOs triggered it. Like that's what I believe happened. I mean, there's no way to know that, but those things seemed very connected to me for sure.
I noted this. At the 18-minute and 20-second time count, you said you went from an atheist to believing in God. And then you said, I had a soul. Like that was a revelation to you.
Yeah.
Like, fill me in. That's like, I mean, it doesn't get much deeper than that. That is like that's the question that philosophers have struggled with over the eons.
Yeah. It's, it seemed so obvious to me before that a soul was not real. And it felt so obvious to me afterward that it was.
Wow.
And that's hard to explain or how that happened. But I just knew, and that's not a thing I've ever questioned since. Like, I think that since that day, I actually had always had like a lot of like existential dread. And like, even as a kid, I would be very afraid. You know, I would stay up late at night having like panic attacks, thinking about like, I'm going to die someday. And because I really believed that like, that was just it. That was it. And I very much don't believe that anymore. And I'm not excited to die, but I'm not afraid of dying. And I see life entirely differently. I see it, you know, as somebody who believes that they have a soul and that that's important and that I need to cultivate that and that I need to respect it in others and that like there's a meaning to all of this. And that's not something that I had before. And I get really sad thinking about that sometimes because I realize now like what injury it does to a person to deny their soul and to that's like a real violence that you can do to yourself. And, you know, I think that's why so much of that experience, I felt like I was being told like that had to happen because you have to know that headspace. Like you have to know it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think I was like angry, you know, because just realizing that like what I had done to myself, I guess, by not believing in that.
So I've had my own set of experiences, and I understand that more than you know. So you quoted John Keel in that first podcast episode, and you talked about how he had cataloged accounts of people saying that they had the direct experience of knowing everything, like knowing everything in the universe. You're nodding.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was like the first time when I read that I read something that sounded like what had happened to me. Because when it happened to me, like I didn't know that. Now I've found out that that's happened to lots of people.
And they all forget, and they all have the same story where they say, well, now that I'm back, I can't tap into it.
Right, exactly. But it still changes them, you know? And so, yeah, but at the time I hadn't heard that before. And so that was like a huge relief to me. I think for so many experiencers, that's like such a hard thing is when you think it's just you.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very lonely place to be. And when you find that there's other people who can like describe this unnameable thing that you can barely bring yourself to talk about, and like they can also talk about it, like you're like, okay, like that is a really big step. And so that was a really big step for me, was finding that.
Have you read a book called Revelation, the Divine Fire by Brad Steiger?
No.
Put that one on your list because that's the central focus of the book is these revelation, these kind of transformative events that shatter people and then they rebuild, or they're instantaneously changed.
Yeah, no, and that seems to be that's the big secret, right? Like that's the thing that.
Well, it's not a secret. It's out there. The information's out there. It's in our religious texts.
Right.
It's all over the place in our religious texts, but it's not in our consensus reality as defined by, let's say, mother culture.
Right, exactly. And it's weird that we've kind of like amputated ourselves in that way as a culture. I think that's really unfortunate.
And it is sad. It is sad, yes. But I mean, I can see taking a wide angle view with the cosmic viewer, how it would help to have lived your life to a certain point, not believing in the soul. And it just struck me that you said it was sad that you had lived your life up until that point. That's really touching. You didn't articulate that in the podcast just as clearly as you did just now here.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, this feels like a safer space, and I feel like probably your listeners can handle some of that a little more. I never want when I talk about this stuff for people to feel like like I'm a zealot. Like I feel that I have found the way and that all other ways are not the right way, and I know what feels like to feel like you don't have a soul. And I don't want people to hear I want people to hear that, like, I feel like I do, and that that's made my life better, but I don't want people to hear that I feel like there's something wrong with them, or that they're bad or something, or that I look down on them in some way, or that, like, I've found some sort of superiority through that. So I feel like I have a hard time talking about that part of it sometimes,
Hmm.
just because, like, of my role as, like, like a podcaster, and like the very particular approach that I take in my work and the people that I normally talk to. I try to decenter myself a bit, and so I don't talk about that stuff as much.
And you're from the Midwest. Did you grow up in Ohio?
Yes, yeah, for most of my life, yeah.
Okay, there's a kind of Midwestern thing that's kind of like, oh, don't you dare make a fuss about me. It comes up over and over again when I talk to people who have these kinds of experiences. People who have these experiences in California. Oh my God, they're starting a religion,
Right.
So, but people from the Midwest are like, oh, like I just want to just be real careful how I tell my story. So,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, it's come up. It's funny. Just the last podcast I did, there was a woman was from Minnesota, and I had to call her on it. So because she did it, and I do it too. So I'm from the Midwest. I do it too. I know just exactly what you mean. You said that you don't want to feel like you're a zealot. There is no one on earth who fits the definition of zealot more than me. Like I've spent 15 years focused on owls, owls, owls. So I recognize that I'm exactly the person you would point to when you want to think, oh, the UFO thing made Mike crazy. But I feel like I've been a very grounded, or I've tried to be, let's say. I try to be a credible person sharing incredible ideas.
Mhm.
But I can't sugarcoat it. Like it's weird. Yeah.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. Yeah, and I think more with the zealot thing, I'm just more concerned around, I think when it comes to like religion, or like what people believe about God or that sort of thing, I try to just take a lighter touch, just because,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I grew up in a very I grew up in the Midwest, and I grew up Catholic, and I grew up with a certain amount of like religious kind of structure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of the reason I ended up where I was because I was rebelling against a lot of that. So I just try to take a very light touch with people with that kind of stuff.
In that episode, you said, you talked about a fear rooted in the sense that I had been used. This is you talking, that I had been used and changed in some profound way that I didn't understand. And then you followed up with, I was an undeniably happier person because of my experience. I want to hear about that happiness.
Yeah. I think something that happens or happened to me when I suddenly was aware that I had a soul was that, like, suddenly it's not that I didn't care about being a good person before. Like, I did care about being a good person, but I think I had a whole different idea of what that entailed. I mostly felt like if I kind of did no harm and that sort of thing, and I wasn't a jerk, that like that was enough. But after that, I started to see that like if I did the right thing, but like my thoughts were nasty, or my intentions were nasty, or that like if the energy behind it didn't match what I was doing, like I started to realize that my thoughts mattered and my energy mattered as much as my actions, and that my thoughts and my energy were actions, and that I needed to take more control of my energy and my emotions and my thoughts, and that I needed to be more intentional about like the ripples that those things were creating in the world. And I suddenly cared a lot more about bringing my best self to situations, and trying to be like a force for good. And I'm a very, very far from perfect person by any stretch of the imagination, and none of this changed that. But it changed what I care about, and it changed what I value, and the standards to which I try to hold myself, basically.
So you had this experience. You eventually started a podcast. It was about a year into your podcast before you Now, let me just sit back. Was I the first experiencer that you had on the show that spoke about it so openly, I guess?
I think you were actually. Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to think if there's anybody. I think it was you. Yeah.
I just listened to it leading up to this conversation now. Wow. In part 2 of your podcast, there's a lot to that one. There's a lot of moving parts in that second episode, but you talked about the spiritual emergency. And you never quite said it, but I would call your 2 minutes on the bed covered in UFO books as a burst of spiritual emergency. It was a short spiritual emergency as opposed to, the longer things that other people have had to deal with. So first for the listeners, and I could do it too, but for the listeners, what would be your definition of spiritual emergency?
That's a really good question because I think the question that I was really trying to answer in the episode, at least for myself, was like, is there really a difference between what has been called a spiritual emergency and just sort of like being crazy? Because the thing I was really concerned about was, am crazy. And so finding somebody talking about something and it's spiritual emergency that sounds a lot like what I had gone through and other experiences that people have that are related, like felt like a relief in a lot of ways, but it also in some ways like didn't really answer the question of like what causes this to happen. I think that what a spiritual emergency is when we're somehow confronted with the fact that the world, that reality is not quite what we were told, or that we are not quite what we are told, or one of those things. There's a way in which I think someone can get in touch with the vastness of the reality beyond the obvious everyday one that we live in, and can tap into something that is human and that is part of being human that we don't usually access in our day-to-day. And that when that happens in a really like disruptive way or an eruptive kind of a way where it happens all at once, that like it can cause people to, have a lot of difficulty. It can be a really, really positive thing. It can be a transformative thing if you work through it, but can also be really terrifying and disruptive to the ego and to the sense of self and to your just everyday life. And I think it's when somebody suddenly realizes that the world of consensus reality is not the world, and whatever it is that plunges you into that, I think can be this stuff is not easy. It's hard.
Yeah. So I don't know how much I've shared with you. I'm been open with this, but I had a nervous breakdown when I was 30. I'm 62 now. And I was suffering from debilitating clinical depression, and it just derailed my life. So essentially I crumbled, metaphorically, I crumbled to nothing, and then I had to rebuild myself. And I clearly look at that chapter of my life as a spiritual emergency. I look at it in hindsight that way. And it's so easy to connect the dots to that event and to the person I became afterwards, and to the fact that I have written a bunch of books and done a bunch of podcasts and put myself out there very, very publicly trying to address this. Now, you talked about a fellow named Tom Matt and his spiritual emergency. He read aloud from a memoir. It was really, that was rough to listen to that, to like peer into the psyche of someone that distressed. But in the aftermath of that, he achieved like a powerful, almost mystical states of creative visualization. Am I summing that up?
Yeah, no, I think you did great. Yeah, I mean, Tom's story is really fascinating, and it took me a long time to tell it because it's a hard one to tell. I think that though the reason I think I was drawn to it and the reason I ended up being the one to tell it was because I think there's a lot contained within it, and because I needed to go through that. Like I needed to be challenged personally on that level because, I'm the daughter of psychiatrists. Mm-hmm. And so like I grew up with a very particular worldview. And so when these things started happening to me, it was really hard not to just see what was going on in my life is like diagnostic criteria for mental illness, basically. And I didn't know how to process that. And I met Tom, and his story was really compelling to me. But like, yeah, his memoir is harrowing. And I think that I give Tom so much credit for just being so courageous and forthright with telling every part of his story. And his story really is that he had a cocaine addiction that kind of spiraled out of control. And he ended up in a state of like profound psychosis that lasted years. And that the story is crazy. It's called Jesus Goes to Hollywood because that's like, part of one of the many delusions that he had along that time was that he was literally Jesus. And he was, staying, I think, at the Beverly Hills Hotel, thinking he was Jesus and fighting demons. Like, this is the stuff that people go through. But then he came out on the other side of it. And as he got sober and he began to stabilize and, he was reunited with his family and he started to put his life back together. He realized that he suddenly had a propensity for math that he never had before and like an interest in it, was writing like mathematical proofs. And then he also had this new ability that he calls upsight, which is basically like a sort of complex, interactive, holographic overlay over his reality. And that sounds insane. Like that sounds like
psychosis. Yeah.
It's exactly. It sounds like somebody who'd gone through psychosis just had a continuing psychosis, and this is how the psychosis has evolved now. But long story short, he got tested at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and they're writing a paper about it, and they were able to identify that like when he's doing upsight, that it's a distinct and anomalous brain state that can't be explained by he's not just imagining it or hallucinating it. Like there's something else that's being engaged there, which is fascinating. So
after I had my experience, I was 30 years old. That would have been in 1993. It was a long time ago. Afterwards, I wrote a 9-page essay. It was totally cathartic. It helped me enormously. I wrote a 9-page essay, short, trying to make sense of my depressive episode. And I titled it Dark Days, A Memoir of Madness. And you read aloud. I was walking in the trail. I had my earbuds in, and I was listening to you, and you said that Tom Matt wrote about his spiritual emergency or his psychotic events, and the subtitle of his memoir was A Memoir of Madness. And that really stopped him in my shoes, because I got a pretty thick skin as far as what I call a synchronicity and stuff like that. But that one really caught me. And it was because of that, it's only a couple weeks ago, at most, because of that, I had to rethink and look at my own event. And I said, that is that textbook spiritual emergency. And I had actually written about spiritual emergencies in one of my books about Stanislav Grof and Christina Grof, and how they were introduced to each other by Joseph Campbell.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's awesome.
Oh, isn't that? So, yeah, Christina Grof was a student of Joseph Campbell, and she came to Joseph Campbell and said, "I'm suffering from these issues," and he said, "Who you should talk to? You should talk to Stanislav Grof." And then they eventually got married. And they defined spiritual emergency, and it's now in the DSM. Is that what it's called?
Mm-hmm.
So it's now a recognized malady within psychiatric medicine.
That's great.
In part 2 of that podcast series, you said, I started out as a scientific-based investigator and podcaster, and I led people down this path. And now I am lost.
Yeah.
Now to me, that statement is at the heart of the greatest stories. You led people down a path. You started out as a scientific-based investigator. You led your listeners down a path, and then you said, and now I am lost. That is the heart of such a good story. I realize I'm seeing the world as a story, but to me, when I heard that, I was like, oh, that's the podcast I want to listen to. I want to listen to the podcaster who is lost and seeking, and the one who's searching. And if you're searching, it's not like you're searching. Your first series of podcasts, I knew the books you were referencing. I knew a lot of the people you were obviously talking to, and a lot of the people you were referencing. But that really felt powerful to me, that you could be so clear about your own sense of being adrift, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's been like, I feel like I've been going through a big initiatory process that started, obviously when I had that experience, but there was kind of a new one. Once you get through one step, then suddenly you get initiated into the next step. And I feel like when we started working on COSMOSIS, it kind of started a new, there's a lot of stuff that happened around that same time that just sort of restarted the cycle for me. And I think that a lot of this last year has been about coming to terms with the fact that, like, of exactly that feeling of just being lost, but also being like, that was a very important step for me to get to, was to recognize that I was. Because when I started this, I wanted to do this, I really thought, I'm like, okay, so everything that I think about the world appears to be wrong in some fundamental way, but I am going to somehow explore this but I'm going to do it with a safety net, and I'm never going to totally let go of the line that connects me to reality. And I'm going to find a way to do this. And I think I'm glad that I did it that way, and I'm glad that I approached it in that way. But at a certain point, logic doesn't get you there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And at a certain point, so much of this has been a journey to accept myself and to accept what happened to me, the things that I actually believe to be real, the things that I actually believe to be important about the work that I want to do. And I can't do that by constantly being self-conscious about the reality of it or trying to, like, package it in some certain way. I can't do it without being vulnerable, I don't think. And so I've had to be I feel like I've had to be humbled in a lot of ways over the last year. And that knowing that I was going to have to write that episode, I think it took me a long time, because that was the only place the episode could really go.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the one place that I didn't want to go, was to the place where I was like, and I've lost the thread. Like, I have a lot of ideas and these things all appear to be connected. And I think that it's important, but I don't actually know. And I think that was important for me, but it was hard. And it took me a lot of, I am prideful. And it took me a long time and a lot of cosmic prodding to get there. But I think I've arrived at that place.
Oh, but anything worthwhile, I mean, if you open yourself to being vulnerable and to there's a quote from Joseph Campbell. I'm going to turn this back to Joseph Campbell. He was such a huge inspiration for me for a long time. I just immersed myself into his work. He referenced the myth of the Knights of the Round Table. And there was a point when they all had to go on a quest. And so each of the knights went into the darkest part of the forest where there was no path. And that became front and center for me, because I was, and to some degree still am, I know exactly what you're experiencing. And I consciously had to say, no, I am going to follow this. I am going to, I wanted to deny these things were happening. I wanted to say no, I wanted to reject all of it. But I got to the point where I said, no, I have to enter the darkest part of the forest where there is no path. And that's an ancient myth. So this is nothing new to the human experience, but it is something that many people don't do. They don't step off the well-worn path. And that's where I'm going to get back to the story again. That's where a true human story can emerge, from exactly that kind of abandonment.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think it's funny, there are all these things that makes so much sense now. But, like, my dad was a psychiatrist, and he was Jungian, and he was very into Joseph Campbell. And so I grew up with these ideas, around the hero's journey,
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of thing. And then as I got older, and before I did all of this, I worked in marketing. And, that was something that had been taught to me and that I was teaching my teams. It was like one of the most powerful tools that I had found was the hero's journey in terms of I was using that in marketing efforts and seeing how effective it was. And getting to this place of recognizing that, that the hero's journey isn't just a story, because stories aren't just stories, that stories are a technology, and that the hero's journey is kind of like the most basic part of that technology. And it's a technology for the evolution of the human soul. And that we love that story more than any other story. All of our blockbuster hits, all of our biggest, series and novels, right? This is the story that we like, almost to the exclusion of all other stories. But I think in our modern day life, especially, that we're consuming stories all day long. We're consuming stories, but we're not living stories. And I think that the hero's journey is so important to try to understand when you're when you're living your story, what you should do next, right? Or what you should be okay with for a while, at least.
Well, you're certainly living your story, I have to say. So you would say, oh, I'm adrift. What was the line you used? You said, I led people astray and now I'm lost. But in that time period, you created a 3-part documentary series that's being very, very well received, and you made it happen. I mean, you did it.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's been quite the journey. It's been quite the journey.
So I would say I would argue that yes, you may feel like you're lost. I don't know how you feel right this moment now, but you certainly achieved something, and I don't think that's an end point. I'm sure there's lots more you're going to achieve, but yeah, that I'm struck by the fact that you said, "Oh, I'm lost," and then your creative output produced something groundbreaking in the sense. Okay, go ahead.
That I wish I could take more credit for that. It's a strange.
Well, written by Kelly Chase. It says it right at the end of the credits. So you should get there's I don't know who else to point to.
Right. But I think that when I know that something I've written is done is when it's better than I feel like I could have made it. And so I've gotten this in this different sort of relationship to my creativity since all of this happened, where I'm finding that I can be lost and that's okay. But that if I just keep showing up to the process, that something comes through that is kind of better than the thing I would have made. And that my job is just to show up. And so, this year has been a lot about me kind of learning how to do that and to trust that process, even when I feel lost myself, is just to keep showing up, and somehow it works out.
Well, it did work out. Yeah. You should be proud.
Yeah. I mean, I'm happy about it. I'm in awe of the many factors that conspired to make it possible. I'll say that. We were beyond lucky in terms of investors, collaborators, people who showed up to offer their talents for literally nothing just because they believed in us. And that's been a really magical process, is to see sort of that team come together. And when we needed something or someone, that person or thing just appeared. And it was a really special experience. I'm kind of in love with collaborative creativity right now. It's something that I find really fulfilling.
Well, if you're in love with something you find fulfilling, then I guess you found something. And if you found something, I just here's something. This is actually, I went back and re-listened to the interview that you did with me, and you said something, and I wrote this down, and you said, there's something about this phenomenon that forces you into being the main character in your own story. And I think that actually is at the heart of what it means to be human. I like the technicians talking about the Tic Tac thing, and they're analyzing the video and stuff like that. They don't turn to each other and say that to each other while digging through files that have been hidden away in government archives. Maybe they do. Maybe I'm seeing this incorrectly, or but that's a beautiful statement. You said it so plainly, and this is the kind of poetry that is a part of this fringe aspect of ufology. And I would also say this is what experiencers get to when they have a heart-to-heart. They get to the deepest part of what it means to be human. Why are we here? What does it all mean? Mm-hmm. What happens when we die? Is there a God? These are the questions that the UFO mythos, I've given up what UFO even means, but the mythos of UFO forces any thoughtful person to ask those questions.
It does. And I think, I will say, I think that probably a lot more people in ufology who never talk about this stuff publicly, I think if you work in this field, that people have at least some awareness of that aspect of it. I was really struck. I went to the first Soul Symposium conference, and Diana Wallace-Pasulka gave this beautiful talk about what she had learned about the different schools of ufology. That there was sort of, she was talking through all of that, like in the past, and how this has been approached in different ways. But she said, what I want to talk about is the fourth school of ufology, which is an emergent school. And she talked specifically about how, the work that she did with Tyler D from her book, American Cosmic, that created like a whole new string of inquiry and collaborations that have spiraled out and had these ripples that have gone in all these different directions that have borne fruit in ways she never could have anticipated. And that she thinks that that emergent school of ufology is what is happening now and what's so important. And then Carl Nell got up there and said, yes, like that is something. It was a subtle moment, but he was acknowledging that, yes, that the emergence of this, the way that people come together in this field that are meant to be brought together, and the way, these things happen, that there is something. I think that almost anyone who works in this field has the sense that there's something bigger going on, mm-hmm. both to us and through us. And I think that in some ways is like the biggest secret also. Like I think everybody who deals with it knows it, but it's the part that there aren't very many people who communicate that in a public sort of way for fear of just sounding like a Looney Tune, I guess. But it's happening. And I think it's extraordinarily significant that it is happening in the way it's happening.
And that in a way, that's been my job description in a way. And that's the role of the owl, in the sense that I've been collecting these owl stories. They are on the weird spectrum, way on the outlying, they're as weird as they get. And I mean, you must have, I'm not telling you anything you probably haven't, you go to a UFO conference and you sit down at the bar at the end of the day and you sit next to some very, very conservative nuts and bolts researcher, and you get a couple glasses of wine into them and you say, hey, you got any weird stories? And they roll their eyes like, oh, I've got the weirdest stuff. I could tell you the weirdest things. And they tell you the stuff that is so normal when you start collecting these stories, but they don't share publicly. They're worried about their reputation. There's a line that Richard Dolan, he was covering some of the more outlying stuff, the weird stuff, the high strangeness stuff, and someone kind of interrupted him and said, aren't you worried about your reputation? He said, my reputation? I'm a UFO investigator. I don't have a reputation. I'm already considered weird by the mainstream. So I'm trying to break that wall down, and I'm doing it consciously. And I recognize how thick that wall can be.
Yeah, but I think that's so important, right? I mean, it's nonsensical in a lot of ways. It's like, there is sort of this understanding that if you work in this space, but you identify as an experiencer, that in some ways, especially to the outside world and to skeptics and even just mainstream people, if you've had an experience, now there's this asterisk next to your name where it's well, maybe they're a nut job though. Mm-hmm. But it's strange because it puts us in this weird situation where it's well, who's supposed to be studying this stuff? It's like saying, I only want to hear from oceanographers who've never seen the ocean, why, of course, people who study this have experiences. Of course they do. Mm-hmm. And so we have to get past that somehow, because for some reason, actually having interacted with the thing that you spend your life studying somehow makes you suspect in this one case, which is strange.
I should actually make a list of the researchers who have put out books, been front and center and later come out that, yes, I am in fact an experiencer. The list is pretty long. Yvonne Smith, Kathleen Marden, Robert Hastings. Like off the top of my head, I could probably dozens I could come up with. But let me change the subject here. Mm. So you started out as this dry, scientific, grounded researcher and podcaster. And then you started getting into, you even used the word woo. That's a good word for you?
Yeah, I'm full woo. I'm there.
Yes. You're full woo. You're there. How's that been for you? Is there any pushback?
Yeah. I mean, obviously there's definitely been some. It's not been as bad as I thought it would be. I mean, clearly there have been people who, I've gotten emails and reviews or whatever from people on the podcast who are like, I liked you up to this point and now I don't. And like, that's okay. I think that you start to realize that, when I started this, I drew my line of like the line I wasn't willing to go past in, one place. And then I end up moving it and then end up moving it. And then everybody kind of ends up drawing that line somewhere. And it's not my responsibility to like get somebody over that line or to, that's not my place. And if they're not in a place to have the next part of the conversation that I'm excited to have, then like, that's fine. And so I've just sort of become more open about that. But I also have been surprised at how many people are willing to kind of have that next part of the conversation and have been kind of starved for it. Like, it's always a little scary for me because I've always really decentered myself in my work. And it's only really recently with those 2 episodes that I've talked much about myself. And I've been careful the extent to which I've gone into the woo. And the more I do that, the more people like it, actually. Like, I think that being vulnerable, I don't know if people would take it the same way if I was like, and here's what happened to me and I have the answer and it's, because I never claimed to have that answer. I don't have any more answers than I had before, but I can just be like honest about what's happening in my life and what I see and what I think. And I think when I approach it that way, that people tend to be pretty open to it and that there's like a much larger audience there than I anticipated of people who are ready to kind of have that bigger conversation.
And as you said, people are hungry for it. People are hungry for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I see that in my UFO Rabbit Hole community and all over the place where people are, a lot of the conversations that are happening in some of the, it's great that we have Twitter and Reddit and kind of these like larger town square places where people can connect with each other. But, there's a real dominance of the conversation. Like, you kind of like, if you don't fall into like one of a few camps, like you just kind of get shouted down all the time. There aren't really a lot of deeper conversations going on. But people are looking for a place to have those conversations. And because people's lives are being changed all the time. Like, it's the most interesting thing, like the amount of people who have gotten into this stuff because of my podcast and they're a part of the community. And now they're like, decided that now they're going to do Reiki or they're going to, change their life in some fundamental way and start doing a work that feels like more aligned with their purpose. Mm-hmm. Like, what is that? What is it that UFOs does that to people? And so consistently. Just learning about them. You don't even necessarily have to have seen one. And so I'm fascinated by that. And I think that's going to be where I'm kind of don't care much about the rest of it anymore. That's the part that's most interesting to me.
When I started my blog, I don't keep up with the blog at all anymore, but for about 10 years, I was writing about, it started just as, it was synchronicities. Initially, I have a lot of synchronicities, and they make a great blog post. They're short, and they got a little punchline and everything. And then it quickly turned into this UFO stuff. And then it quickly turned into this owl stuff. And then more stuff started happening. It was like I was in this synchronistic echo chamber. And I went a little crazy. And it's right there. Like, it's not hidden. And people responded. This would have been in 2009, 10. People responded right away. And so it felt like I had a core group of people reading it. And Mac Tonys was one of them. And Red Pill Junkie was right there at the very beginning. Greg Bishop was right there right at the beginning. And like, I felt like I was immediately being supported by a community. It felt great. It felt so great. And it was also, they were really good at like saying, oh, you missed something here, or oh, look, read this book. And so, but I recognized that other people I found blogs where people said, I never would have told my story if Mike Cleland hadn't told his. And I recognized that I had a responsibility to keep my quality level high and my honesty as high as I could keep it. There's some things that I am choosing not to share just because they involve other people and it's private for them, and so I can't share certain stories. But wow, I've done my very, very best to be as open as I possibly can, to a fault at times, I think. So I guess what I'm saying, and I've said this many times, is I understand the journey you're on. And it's not easy, but I've found that for me, it has been remarkably rewarding in ways that I never, ever, ever would have imagined before stepping off that well-worn path into the darkest part of the forest.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I've appreciated, having you as a friend and like a touch point through a lot of this stuff. I think the first time you and I started talking, I was only like very, very, very initially sort of entertaining the idea that I might be an experiencer and what that actually means.
But you had already had the events of that 2-minute time on the couch, your visionary experience.
Yeah, but I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready. It changed everything about my life, but it took me probably about 2 years to really get to the point where I'm like, yeah, that happened to me. Like I could talk about it and I had talked about it, but it's just like, it's so interesting how I kind of almost split myself in half. Like there was, even as I changed everything about my life, I walked away from my career, I started doing the podcast full time, all of that. There was like, I held that experience at arm's length. And I think things happened too fast for me to really integrate it. And that I've been slowly integrating it since. But my life sped up way beyond the point where I was integrating. And so I was sort of, I think I'm even now working through and trying to come back to a singular me, as opposed to sort of like there's this part of me that's holding this other thing apart because I just wasn't totally ready. But it's been a process.
But that's human nature. Like when I started my blog and I was doing my podcast for years. And I was telling stories. I got lots of stories, missing time and seeing aliens in my yard and I was fully in denial. I wasn't going there. I could tell these stories anecdotally, like, oh, isn't that interesting? But I never took the next step and say, am I involved in this?
Right.
And, I think it's human nature to be your own worst critic. If someone else had told me those same stories, I would have been very understanding and recognized the implications. But when it's yourself, wow, I have a different set of standards on myself that are much more harsh.
Yeah, no, I have the same. I have the same thing. And also I think, like when I had that initial experience and I was told to start, I'm not even told to start it. I knew that I would, and then I did. And I knew that there was a show coming and that it was going to take about 3 years. And like literally 3 years and a month after I launched the podcast, we launched the show. And like, I knew that stuff was going to happen somehow.
Wait, so you knew that you were going to do a documentary?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
okay. I don't know if you've said this as plainly as you just said it just now. So
yeah, well, because that's one of those things I don't talk about, right? Because it sounds crazy to say.
Oh, this is my job as a podcast host, to really do my best and dig deep, to work to understand these really complex experiences. And I want to hear this. I want to hear your story. I want to hear this because it's fascinating. Keep going. Sorry.
Okay. Because like it sounds crazy to say, you're going to do that. And also at the time,
not to me, it doesn't sound crazy. It sounds normal to me.
Right. Well, you're further down the road than me. But I just felt like that I knew that was going to happen, but like there's knowing it and there's knowing it. Right. And I had no idea how that would come to pass. I had never done anything like that before. I didn't have any kind of experience doing that. And so, I started the podcast and things just sort of unfolded, and I was never like working towards a particular timeline. I was just always sort of somehow in line with this timeline that it seemed kind of bizarre and impossible to me at the time. And then having the kind of, I don't have much of an idea of what comes after this. It was really kind of like 3-year thing that I showed. And so, but coming to the point where like all of those things have sort of come to be, and now there's this new cycle. It's like I've had to come to terms with it in a new way, because it wasn't just that I was shown this stuff and it like changed my life. It was that I was shown this stuff and it changed my life, and then all these things that I didn't think were possible then happened right when I was kind of told they were going to happen. And so now like that's a whole different level of coming to grips with it, right? And I feel like I'm just going to be. I feel like I'm always living in kind of different stages of metabolization around this stuff. Because in some ways I'm like, I can say I can accept it, but there are parts of me that haven't fully accepted all of it either. Because it's just so weird. Like, what happened? What a weird thing.
Yeah. I agree. I totally agree. Yeah. And there is no easy answer. And what I can say is that you said it plainly. We talked about it. You said your life is better now.
Yeah, it is. What's funny is that like my mom called me up recently and just said, I'm sorry, because I know that when you were a kid, she's like, I feel like you knew who you were when you were a kid, and that like everyone, including me, just tried to talk you out of it. But like I had always sort of wanted to go to film school, but that wasn't like a thing that was going to happen for me at that particular stage of my life. And like for a variety of reasons. And when I was younger, like I was a very atheistic adult, but in my younger years, like kind of like my early teen, preteen kind of years, like I was really into parapsychology, and I was really into, all kinds of things along these lines. And I sort of got talked out of all of it. But my mom was like, I can see that like you're being the person that you always have been and that you knew that you were. And I really do feel like I'm being the person that like right now is the most authentic expression of who I am. Like if 8-year-old me had the wherewithal to like just choose anything and do it, this would be it. And that is in itself, I think, really powerful. Like I'd always been trying to fit myself into a different story about myself. And it wasn't until I started just like actually being the person that I am that things started to really work for me. And so that's been a really cool experience.
Cool experience. That's like an understatement. That's like nobody gets that experience. Like so many people are walking around and never approach that experience that you're talking about. That's joyous that you can say that. I feel like I was raised in the Midwest in the 60s, and I certainly felt the pressure from my parents to not be what I was clearly creative. I think I would have been diagnosed back then as like hyperactive. I don't think there was that kind of diagnosis out there, but I had tons of energy. I was incredibly creative. My parents had no way to support that. And so they kind of forced me, pigeonholed me, needled me to go into advertising. I rode my bike to an ad agency and worked as like a 15-year-old. It was before I had my driver's license. Rode my bike to an advertising agency and did pre-production illustrations for storyboards and stuff like that. And then I went to film school. So you said you wanted to go to film school. I did go to film school. I dropped out. And then I worked in advertising because I was in New York City. It was this incredibly exciting chapter of my life. But I did work that I didn't care about.
Yeah.
Like I was doing pre-production storyboards for dishwashing liquid in the Honey Nut Cheerio bee. It was pretty soulless. And you can just follow the timeline of my life. Like I was doing this soulless work and I had a nervous breakdown. I dropped out of my former life and moved out west and started working for an outdoor school. I worked there for close to 20 years, doing really, really powerful, rewarding, inspiring work deep in the wilderness, 30-day trips, big wilderness, Canadian Rockies, Alaska, all up and down the Rocky Mountains, Utah. And that came to an end. It came to a screeching halt when I started looking into this UFO stuff. That chapter of my life just ended.
Yeah.
And I wasn't ready for it to end. Like it was ending out from underneath me. I did a hypnosis session with Mary Rodwell in 2017. Now I'm going to share this. It's a little short glimpse of something. I never say that it's true. It's true that I had the experience under hypnosis of having this memory, this visionary experience appear in my mind's eye, and I recited it, and it's recorded on the recording that was made during the hypnosis session, but I don't know if this really happened. So she said, go to this place where you need to go to get the information. And I said, well, I'm in my yard in Idaho. I was living in upstate New York at the time, but I had been living in Idaho up until 2015, 10 years ago. And so I'm in my yard in Idaho, and I walk in the house, and it was just like, it was lit so perfectly. Oh, it would have been a summer night. That's how it's lit. The screen door was open a certain way. It made the noise. It was so visually perfect of just the interior, the season, the time. And so I walk into the kitchen. The lights aren't on yet. And there's a gray alien standing in the kitchen waiting for me.
Oh, wow.
And I go, what are you doing here? And it says, the things that you agreed on, they're starting. They're going to start right now. So your old life is ending and your new life is now beginning. So that what you agreed on, what you agreed about, is beginning now. And so I don't know exactly when that was, but I can kind of put where I was at that time in the house, and that was exactly when the synchronicities just invaded my life with a ferocity that is hard to put into words. This I don't know, I can't say whether this really happened, but if I look at the timeline of my life, if it was to happen, it would happen right around that chapter. I would have been living in that house. The implication is that I chose this in some previous, you're nodding, is that I chose this in some previous incarnation, and that I am living out my duty. That's a rough word. I'm performing a role now that I chose, that I knew that I would be performing now. I'm saying, the words are coming out of my mouth. It sounds crazy. What I can say is it feels true. That doesn't mean it is true, but it feels true.
No, I'm smiling because like I have the same sense. And in that experience that I had, that was very much the tenor of it. And the thing that I came to understand out of it, like I said, I can't prove that to anyone. I'm not interested really in proving it to anyone, but like I have the deep sense, I have like a knowing that I agreed to this, that like as much as I've rebelled against it, and that there's a part of me that I'm just that way. I'll always rebel against anything that I feel like is.
Oh, you and me. Oh boy, you're defining me. Yeah, keep going. I don't work at that outdoor school because I was a rebel at that school. Keep going. Yeah. So.
Exactly. But no, I get the sense that I'm supposed to, that I'm agreed to this, that there's a purpose to it, and that, you know, so much of my life up to that point had felt like it didn't make any sense. And I was always just trying to like find a way to make myself make sense. And after I had that experience, I understood I needed a wide variety of weird ass experiences to get to this place where I could do the thing that I needed to do next. And suddenly it all made sense. And I realized that I did agree to it, and that like I am ready. And I know that sounds crazy. And I don't even totally know what that thing, I don't know what that thing is either. Like I don't make a lot of presumptions about that. And I think it's better to not make a lot of presumptions about that, you know, because I think a lot of people get that sense, and I think it can be damaging to certain people. Like you can get, you know, you see some people get too much of like almost like a messiah complex, or like, you know, that you have to understand that like, yes, that's a very important thing and you should pay attention to it, but that it's also something that happens all the time to a lot of people, and that like it's both special and not special. But yeah, I mean, I have that sense, and I think a lot of people do. And I feel like when I find the people that I'm supposed to do work with, they show up and I'm like, well, there you are. And I just have that sense of like, all right, it's time. And I don't know to do what exactly, but I think all you can do is just show up. And I think it's cool that so many of us have that sense, even though it's kind of scary to talk about.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. You said earlier, you know, you said you needed to keep quiet about this stuff. You're like not allowed to talk about it. And then I kind of wrote down like I'm like, it's hard to shut me up about this stuff.
Well, we need you because of that, Mike.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, so yeah, so I am that zealot that like wants to beat the drum of the high strangeness, and because I feel like that's the purpose of these experiences, is to transform people. And in order to transform someone, like when someone's asleep, and if they're really deeply asleep, you got to shake them to wake them up.
Yeah. I think that's true. I mean, and I think that the beauty of it is that everybody has their own role to play, that we're not all, we didn't all agree to do the same thing. We all agreed to do something different. And I think it's really cool. Something that I've really enjoyed about, meeting you and meeting so many other people in this field is that I don't think I've ever met so many people who just know who they are. And, maybe they don't have every question answered, but they have a good enough sense of who they are to kind of let that purpose take a center place in their consciousness and in their life and in their intention. And that's a really cool thing, to be around people who are doing their best to live into what they believe their purpose to be. That's not a thing that people do very much in our modern life. And I think it's cool. I really like it.
Anything else you want to share before we say goodbye? You can push the documentary series more. You're allowed to promote.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if people want to watch the docuseries, I think episode 3, definitely for people who are deeper in the pool. We tried to make one into, we were trying to thread the needle of being both accessible as possible and also pushing the ball as far down the field as we felt that we could in a first season in 3 episodes. But I hope people will like it. And I hope that they feel represented in it. If you're an experiencer, I hope that you feel respected and seen in maybe a way that you haven't felt in that particular medium as much. And yeah, and I hope that it can also be useful, because something that to me, one of the coolest parts of doing this whole thing is that I actually sat down with I have a really big family. And so there were probably 25 people, brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, mom and dad, and other
all at once. They were there all at once?
Yes. Yeah. All together. And we watched episode 3 together. And, they've all sort of seen what's happened to me over the last year and have been very tolerant. And I give them a gold star, all of them, for open-mindedness while I've been going through all of this. But it sparked real conversations afterwards. And I felt for the first time that my family, who's done a really admirable job of just sort of tolerating and being understanding as they could, I feel for the first time they kind of understood what happened to me and why it was so important to me and why I was doing the things that I was doing. So I hope that it can serve that purpose. I hope that it can sort of help people start conversations and have conversations with people in their life, because it's really hard. It's really hard. My family, like I said, I give my family nothing but credit. But when but in the back of their mind that they're just not quite sure what happened to you, there's something, being able to have those conversations for me was really healing. And so I hope it does that. I hope it helps in that way.
This has been a joy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mike. And thank you for, being a friend through all of this. I really appreciate it.
How do people find you online?
You can find me, my website's down right now, but hopefully I'll fix it, UFORabbitHole.com. But you can also find me on probably the easiest places like Twitter or Instagram. It's UFO_rabbit_hole. And you can find me kind of on all the big socials. And then there's a link in my bio that'll take you to the show or anything else you want to find.
And you have a Patreon site.
Yes, I always forget about pushing that. Yes, I have a Patreon. It's a really special little community of big-hearted, big-thinking individuals. We have a private Discord. We do monthly Zoom calls. They do all kinds of activities and plan calls and have their own little things that they do that I'm not even a part of, which I love, that it's just such a bustling little community. But if you'd like to be a member of that, patreon.com/UFO Rabbit Hole.
I look forward to talking more. This has been just a delight.
Yes, me too. Thank you so much, Mike.
Bye now. This is Mike chiming in after the editing. First, and most importantly, I need to say this was exactly what I want in these shows. We really went for it, and I need to thank Kelly for her openness and her willingness to go so deep. She clearly addressed her concerns about being so vulnerable, and I understand that, and I can't separate that kind of vulnerability from courage. They are intertwined. This was a brave show. A few things you might not hear because I made sure to edit my own voice, but for reasons I don't understand, I was really frazzled in my role as host. Now, even on my best days, I'm a bit chattery in how I talk. I stammer and repeat words, and this is normal for me. It has been all my life. But for some reason, on this show, I was like absurdly amped up and stammered with a fury that was more than a little bit embarrassing. Now, during the editing, I listened to the entire show with my headphones, and I did my best to streamline that awkwardness. So you, the listener, will hear a much less frantic version of how I really was. Now, I don't know the source of this, but all I can think of is that this conversation was focused on such deep and such personal experiences that those emotions bled over into my speech. Please know, I did my best to clean up most of the dialogue. That is, unless it was something emotional, then I let it alone, with all the flaws. For me, it feels dishonest to edit those sections. Now, about the show notes. They include the 2 podcasts that we covered in this episode. The first from February of 2024, and the follow-up from 10 months later in December. Also, and I'm not sure why this didn't come up in the episode, Kelly wrote a book. It has the same name as her blog, The UFO Rabbit Hole, and it's subtitled A Rational, Science-Based Introduction to an Irrational Reality. This book is noted as Book 1, so that means there will be more, hopefully soon. Before I end this, what I want to say, more than anything, is that I am enormously proud of this episode. I said as much in the intro, but I'm saying it again. This show had a real power to it, and that was all Kelly. I'm enormously impressed with her hard work in this field and her clarity and openness in our conversation for the last hour and a half. Peace and strength, and thank you so much. Bye now. Owls are somehow connected to UFOs. I don't say that lightly. After over a decade of obsessive investigation, I am convinced of this connection. As strange as it may seem, people are seeing owls in the highly charged moments of a UFO sighting, and within the challenging memories of UFO abduction. This mystery has been the focus of my research. My name is Mike Cleland, and I have explored these connections in my book, The Messengers. At its core, this book is simply a collection of stories, and each is a remarkable real-life experience. The Messengers is also my own story of how owls played a role in my life. It's an exploration into the deeply personal questions that arose from my own contact experiences. Whitley Strieber said this about The Messengers.
It's a wonderful book because it's a book that advances us in consciousness. It advances us. It takes us from where we were before we started reading it to a new place in terms of understanding the close encounter experience. I can name just on the fingers of one hand the number of books that actually do that.
The Messengers is the first in a trilogy of books, and each volume explores a deeper aspect of the UFO mystery. Stories from the Messengers, Owls, UFOs, and a Deeper Reality. This is the second in the series, and it tells a series of 19 real-life stories, each with UFOs and owls. The third is Hidden Experience, a memoir of owls, synchronicity, and UFO contact. This is my own story, my emotional journey of coming to terms with very challenging memories and experiences. All my books are available on Amazon in paperback, ebook, and very soon as audiobooks. It's me. I'm back. If I have any sort of a mission statement for this podcast, it's this. There won't be any ads on this show. But the exception is promoting my own work. You clearly just heard an advertisement for my book, The Messengers. So there's that. Also, I have a Patreon site where quite a bit of content is totally open to non-paying members. I feel this information is too important to keep behind a paywall, and I want these shows out there. I want them to be easy to find and easy to listen to. I do offer a few extras for paying members on the Patreon site, and I plan on doing more very soon. These will include some group Zoom chats and more audio extras. If you want to help support this podcast, you could join the Patreon site or use Buy Me a Coffee. That's a sort of online tip jar, and you can find it by searching buymeacoffee.com/Mike Cleland. Another thing that would help support my work would be to rate or review my books on Amazon or Audible. We are in a totally new era, and self-published authors depend on these ratings and reviews. And the same goes for rating or reviewing the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And I would be enormously appreciative if you shared my work, whether that's stuff about the books or the podcasts, on social media. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, although I'm not very savvy on any of these sites. Okay, enough of all this. Signing off again. Peace and strength, and thank you so much. Bye now.